Recording. And welcome, Stuart. Thank you for being here. Stuart is a great friend of regeneration, and a person coming from the west coast of North America, which has this deep knowledge of this ecosystem. And I just want you to present yourself in the best way you want to be seen here. So, Stuart, we are all ears.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melina. I just want to express my profound gratitude to Melina and Ben and Isabel and others, so many others, for helping to hold the space, hold this digital space and make it very human and alive. Having this summit is such a special thing in this delicate time. So very glad to be here and participating. Let me share the screen. I want to give just a brief presentation on this theme of territories of life, and we'll have plenty of ability to discuss and weave some themes together. So this is part of the Bioregional Regeneration Summit, and one of the organizing entities is the Regenerative Communities Network. And one of the things that I love best in my life was being able to help design the Regenerative Communities Network and be there convening and facilitating from early days with John Fullerton's support, Capital Institute, Edward Muller, Jennifer Menke in Costa Rica, many others, Hudson Valley, Denver. We launched with just a few bioregions that were just tentatively sensing into what regeneration might be like. And we realized very quickly that having other learners along the path was very, very helpful. Each region thought it was kind of off on its own adventure, and by connecting with other sense-making regions, sense-making individuals, we began to see there were certain, skills and capacities that were very helpful for this work. And what was blocking one region maybe had opened up in another region. So for instance, in Denver, everyone was wondering how you could have bioregional governance. And in Costa Rica, there's actually a network of 28 recognized territories that have their own territorial councils. So in effect, some bioregional governance already. And just knowing that existed was so helpful for people in Colorado trying to do this work. I have been with the company called Autopoiesis for many years. I co-founded it with my wife and business partner, Catherine Langstaff. Autopoiesis means self-organizing living systems. So my academic work was in the field of complex living systems, and I've taken that lens throughout my life, graduating way back in the early 1990s around the time of the Rio Summit. We've all been realizing for many, many decades now that there's imbalance, crisis, emergency, and hopefully emergency leading to emergence. So I've been on this path for a long time, just to listen, learn, sense make as best I can. And it's a journey between two stories. We're caught in between a story of extraction, colonialism, decay, estrangement from the living world, and a story about reenchantment, re-enlivenment, reconnection, and reparation in the most profound sense. And the theme I wanted to use today to kind of get at that is what are called territories of life. And I wanted to remind us all that this work is complex in the most beautiful way. that it engages all of our senses. It engages our entire being, all chakras. And it's this wonderful unfolding of everything that we are and everything that we are in relation to humans and the more than human world. All of that complexity in the best sense, not the kind of complexity that is deadening, but the actual complexity of the world, which is fully interconnected, inter-enabling, co-arising, codependent, co-creative, all of it. And working with that complexity and realizing you can have framings, you can have principles, you can have ways of working and tools and software and all of this. But at the end, it's just love. It's just returning to our heart and saying, what can I do next? Sensing into this local reality, sensing into my watershed, into my broader, wonderful connected mountain ranges, or the ocean that begins to circle around to other living regions, wherever you may be in the world, sensing into all of that and sensing out to this entire living Gaia, this entire magnificent biosphere, which is this thin layer of breath that holds us all together, that is life. And that thin biosphere, that thin film of living fabric, is the only living fabric that we're aware of anywhere in the universe. Let's hope there are lots more. But for now, this is our living fabric to nurture and play with and learn from. And so the complexity, the cognitive models, all of that. And then at the end, it's just love. It's just falling back in love with all of life, with the world, with place, with the rivers, the mountains, all the weather, even the weather as it changes and frustrates us, loving all of it, loving the changes, loving the possibility of redemption and regeneration. This is my home place. This is an island called Mears Island. That's the colonial name for it. It's a tiny island off the west coast of Vancouver Island, another colonial name, which sits in the Salish Sea. And on this island, you'll find the hanging garden tree, the mother tree, a Western red cedar, 2,000 years old, 70 feet around. And over the centuries, it's sprung entire massive trees off of trees and gardens high up in the tree, whole ecosystems just being held in kind of the crook of the tree branches. This is Kwakwaka'wakw territory. So I grew up in magnificent coastal temperate rainforest, traditional Kwakwaka'wakw territory, many, many other First Nations going up to the north, going into the interior, many of them revitalizing themselves, revitalizing the land along the way. A little bit to the north of where I grew up is the Great Bear Rainforest, and it's a model for the world of regenerating land with Indigenous leadership. So many, many years of negotiations between all of the sovereign nations, different environmental groups, logging, concessions, all of it resulted in protecting almost the entire Great Bear Rainforest and bringing enormous amounts of economic development opportunity, self-guided by Indigenous nations. So I'm proud that all of that work happened just to the north. And I'm speaking to you today from unceded traditional Ohlone territory, San Francisco Bay, a beautiful place. And interestingly, the home of Planet Drum, still around. Planet Drum started in the 1970s as one of the very first bioregional organizations. So taking the most ancient ideas of how we relate to place and putting it into a framework where it could connect with organizing methods, with Western science and so forth. So just one particular modern reinvention of what is the most ancient thing in the world, which is bioregioning, which is just reciprocity with place and all of the beings. I wanted to share an incredible report. It's called Territories of Life, and it's by the ICCA Consortium. You can easily access the whole document online, freely available. ICCA has been working for many years with indigenous communities and traditional communities around the world. And just to define a traditional community, it's a little bit loose, but a community that has been place-based for several decades at least, and has a lot of traditional ways of working with food, with harvesting, with water, with land. So a deeply reciprocal community. So this study looks at indigenous and traditional communities around the world. And I just love this metaphor of territories of life. I wanted to just share it today and make sure everyone knew, what that was, that it's out there. So right now on the planet, about 5% of the population is indigenous, and something closer to 15 to 20% is traditional on top of that. Those communities hold 80% or more of global biodiversity. So even though a relatively small population, incredible stewardship and honoring of biodiversity around the world. And you can see in this image, each of these territories of life is this incredible knotting, this weaving together of language, culture, the place names, the honoring of all the more than human beings, the relationships with water, with different topography, the winged ones, the rooted ones, and how that keeps expressing itself in that place, in that culture over time. So there are many, many thriving territories of life, bioregions that are being stewarded, that are evolving with local people that are deeply, deeply rooted in that place, indigenous and traditional. So that's a territory of life. And perhaps we can make the entire world filled with territories of life. So the places that have been extracted from, the places that have been hollowed out culturally, the places that have been settled with chaos and trauma, loss, destruction in that process. How do we recover these territories of life all over the world, nurturing the ones that are strong, the existing territories of life, like many, many regions in Colombia, all over Africa, South Asia, all over the world. There are these amazing pockets that are territories of life. And imagine them beginning to support, nurture all the neighboring regions as they're learning together how to recreate territories of life. And if you look at the world not through national boundaries, but watersheds, this is what you see. There's an amazing mapper named Robert Suzaks who has created these incredibly detailed watershed maps. You can zoom in and look at these at a much, much finer scale. But basically you're looking at the veins of rivers. So each color is a different watershed, and there are the main stems and the second order rivers and third order and up to 10th order in the Amazon basin, or rivers off of rivers without end. And you could kind of just see, okay, so North America looks different. You see this huge heart that's the Mississippi River Basin. You see the huge Amazon basin in South America. So it's just another way to see the world through water, right? So through culture, through language is a territory of life. This is through water. We can see it through biocultural diversity. So this is from University of Florida Biocultural Diversity Mapping Project. And this image is showing darker bands where there is greater plant diversity, and each kind of white blob represents a distinct language, a kind of local language. And This is the complexity. This is the magnificence of our planet. For one thing, if you look at where the equator is, you'll see that there's an incredible spike of diversity right around the equator. And it turns out that biocultural diversity, so the biological diversity, as well as the cultural and linguistic diversity, is greatest at the equator. And then it slowly declines as you go to the north and to the south. We're not exactly sure why that is, but it shows this incredible correlation. Wherever there's this amazing plant diversity, you'll see this linguistic diversity. And the intuitive way to think about that is, if there's incredible diversity of landscape, of ecosystem, you need a whole new language and way of being and way of acting to be in right relationship with that particular valley, that area, because the plants are different and the animals are different, the water's different. So cultures can co-evolve with that, like in Papua New Guinea, which holds a huge chunk of the world's linguistic diversity on one modest-sized island. And then, if you really want to play with complexity, I just did a quick overlay. It's not perfect, but overlaying that incredible watershed map with the linguistic and plant diversity. And you can just, kind of see certain watersheds popping out as holding this incredible biocultural diversity. So the waters are flowing, people are speaking, we're learning with the more than human all over the world in all of these different ways. And it just creates this mosaic that's beyond description, beyond beautiful. And yet, where we are in 2022, we've had more than 500 years of full-on settler colonialism, roughly dating back to Columbus 1492, although these processes go back even centuries before that. And this is just showing shipping routes, right? These blue lines are huge ships carrying thousands of containers, stuff, a lot of food, right? Being grown from one place and taken to another, amazing ancient rainforests that have been cut down into boards and they're being shipped somewhere else. So that incredible diversity, right? The biocultural diversity of the planet is in this intense, conflicted relationship with 500 years of globalization, colonialism, the trauma, the extraction, the unfairness. And one thing that's fascinating is areas that do have this incredible biocultural diversity haven't quite gotten kind of reined in and kind of locked into those global trade routes. So just something to observe. And we have to hold the paradox that if these blue lines went away tomorrow, there'd be a lot of dislocation, a lot of suffering. People wouldn't have anything to eat, right? So you need a transition, right? We need to hold this complexity, that we need to systemically heal 500 plus years of colonialism with reparations that are regenerative, right? That begin to allow the unfolding of the planet, healing those scars, opening new possibilities for every bioregion to thrive, and reinventing trade so that it's reciprocal, and probably much less trade in bulk goods and in food, and more ethereal trade in ideas and music and cultural artifacts. But we can't naively, look at this global trading system and just naively think we'll get somehow everything perfect and regenerative, whatever that means tomorrow. It's going to be a very complex, conflicted, contradictory process. But we have this amazing matrix, the watersheds, life, the patterns of life holding us together, something to navigate back towards. So how do we even perceive this kind of complexity? this report just came out, and it's really quite extraordinary that it's a UN collaboration. It's the science policy biodiversity collaboration. And it's really quite a profound image showing that this kind of, worldview diversity is even being valued at the UN level. And the way that this report frames it is quite extraordinary, going from, living from a more extractive view. So say it's a river, so you're living from river resources. It's a very anthropocentric view. It's like, how many fish can I get out right now, to living in, to living with. That begins to be a biocentric, ecocentric view, until it's living as, like, we are living as the river. We are the river. We are inseparable. And that's the pluriverse, right? This notion of profound diversity in worldviews and ways of being. And all of that gets us to kind of a cosmovision. And then you can get more specific as needed. So going from those very, very profound background worldviews and knowledge systems, what are the broad values that are tied to that? And then the more specific sort of goals and ways that you might measure them, value indicators. But what this shows us is if we jump into, say, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs, we're kind of jumping into, say, broad values. And from a deeper perspective, there are profound conflicts even between the SDGs themselves and how they're going to be absorbed and worked with in different regions around the world. So the complexity and love of a territory of life, the complexity holding that there may be completely different ways of working and being and seeing, right? And the love that we can find bridges, we can find ways to translate, we can find ways to work through trauma together. We can build those possibilities together, and that is love. I want to really honor Arturo Escobar. This is an extraordinary book, Designs for the Pluriverse. Arturo Escobar grew up in Colombia and for decades has worked with Afro-descendant communities in the Pacific coastal region of Colombia. And Melina, of course, has been based in Colombia for much of her life. It's a profound book, and it's wrestling with this paradox. We have to act. We have to act. The warning signs are endless. The biodiversity reports every day. The climate reports every day. It's terrifying. It's you can't even take it in, right? We're numb to it. We go through all of these emotions around it. So clearly we have to act profoundly, immediately, on all levels, across all of these bioregions. So it's wrestling with how can we act with love, with accuracy across different worldviews. So within that greater pluriverse, how can we act together? How can we frame that and learn together in a way that's not recreating something like colonialism, even with the best of intentions? And that means indigenous leadership. It means when two or more watersheds are working together, there has to be a profound examination of the different worldviews and languages and relationships. And within a single bioregion, within this process of bioregioning, understanding whatever cultural complexity may be present. There may be many different indigenous groups present in a single large bioregion. There may be an overlay of colonialism or overlays of past trauma, past difficult historical experiences. And working through that and designing around that and getting us to a place of restoring our affection for the world and our affection for each other. And I want to honor another incredible person, Julia Watson. This is a very significant book. It's called Low Tech, Low TEK, and of course TEK stands for Traditional Ecological Knowledge. So This is a beautiful look at 20 different bioregions around the world, looking at large landscape stewardship practices, sometimes going back thousands of years, or in Australia, 50,000 years. And looking at this from the eyes of a landscape architect, right? So Julia Watson's trained with contemporary landscape architecture methods, and having reviewed the best thinking from people like Ian McHarg and the great landscape architecture tradition in the United States and other countries, realizing these ancient practices and ways of working with landscape are so far beyond what we can currently design with, starting with more of a Western paradigm around landscape and science. So suggesting a profound fusion, right? Working with these ancient ways of knowing, these still vibrant ways of working with landscape, and having that inform how we work with land all over the world, having this inform the landscape architecture planning professions. And that cover image is actually showing it's a living bridge. So none of these limbs were felled. These are actually just living vegetation trained, right, very gently to form a bridge. And these are often maintained for centuries at a time. So living engineering. So as we think about regeneration, we think about these territories of life, just an invitation that I think some of us are probably working in all these different ways. And it's all great. It's just find what's alive for you. If you're connecting to watersheds or food sheds or fiber sheds, indigenous territories, traditional territories, cultural landscapes. So landscapes where there's still very active shaping by traditional communities and traditional practices. It could be a bioregion, it could be even larger. It could be a whole massive kind of biome, an ecological mega region. So from the bioregional scale, zooming in, maybe it's one tiny watershed that calls you within that bioregion. Zooming out, what are the neighboring bioregions? What kind of larger biome is that bioregion a part of? What are other bioregions around the world that might be similar culturally or in terms of climate pressures? Learning from mountain peoples across the world, like the Mountain Institute. So islands and archipelagos are natural places of regeneration. And Melina, do you have something about breakouts?
Sorry, no, Stuart, I am just broadcasting a message for people who are in the
Got it.
breakouts.
Okay.
And so to prepare our breakouts. So don't worry about that. Sorry.
Okay, great. Ocean, land, villages, towns, cities, this work can happen across a transect from very dense urban centers all the way out to wildlands, perhaps working with organizations that naturally connect across many different bioregions. So how can they have a regenerative connection point wherever they're working? And always seeing the nestedness, whatever scale you're working at, understanding how it can support the action at a smaller scale, at a larger scale, across scale linking. And as we do this work, right, across any of these places in the world, or even the organizations that naturally connect many, many different places, there's so many ways to do the work. I just want to keep emphasizing the pluriverse. We so desperately need so many different threads, framings, ways to get coherent action. And we're drawn to so many different things, whether it's an indigenous community, right, determining in a sovereign way what its own pathway is going to be, whether it's the kind of broader regeneration movement and the many different principles and framings and ways of working there, bioregioning itself, which goes back many decades in a modern context, which goes back 50,000 years in an Australian Aboriginal context, right? These ways of working with land, working with each other to support the health of an entire bioregion. And this connects with the social justice framing. Some of us are really drawn to the justice side of this, that there's been trauma and pain for centuries, and we've got to heal it. We have to think about reparations in a whole new way, that we can revitalize all of these relationships and connection points. Or in the climate debates, this idea of loss and damage or ecological deficit, that overdeveloped nations have emitted the vast, vast majority of greenhouse gases. They need to pay loss and damage to help other countries have a decarbonized pathway. Or 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people, and beautiful ideas around integrated landscape management. So just really practical questions. So how do you get a stable anchor nonprofit or group that can hold a landscape over time and keep convening and linking all the different efforts? Large scale restoration movement, rewilding movement. And then of course, the more tech perspective, those of us drawn to DeFi and refi and digital autonomous organizations and regenerative coins, and just holding the complexity. So every day I'll hear multiple perspectives on, say, a carbon market, where many traditional communities think it's a desecration, which I completely understand. It's slicing, it's dicing, it's commoditizing all over again and extracting. Now it's carbon. And from that perspective, it's not enlivening. And from another side, people trying to completely reimagine finance and figure out, is there a way that we can create climate, currency, biodiversity currency that could be beneficial? Tough, open questions. And we've got to have these dialogues where perhaps it works in certain contexts. Perhaps it's a transitional strategy to have carbon markets. And perhaps it doesn't work.
No.
Melina, I think maybe you should go on mute. And then the idea of bioregional investment platforms, like my good colleague Joe Brewer in Barichara, trying to create a way to connect a whole range of vibrant projects with very long timescales and very diverse kinds of financial returns, holding those up, making them available to investors, right, that can perceive it with their own kind of multiple return lens, not just a financial lens, but social, ecological, all kinds of other returns. Or those of us thinking about sociocracy, or Melina, your work with applied biomimicry for social transformation. Those of us thinking about social process, right? That none of this will ever happen unless we solve fundamental questions around how we do radical collaboration, how we coordinate, how we co-create. So we're just drawn in all these different ways, and it's all good. It's all just part of this healing and exploration. We so need to think about the social justice reparation side and just the basic social coordination side. We need the deep thinking about traditional ecological knowledge, the best Western science around restoration. We need to reinvent the financial side, and on and on. And it's just a huge spectrum from high tech to low TEK, low traditional ecological knowledge. Hang on. So, holding this paradox, how do we understand, being between these stories? How do we accelerate regeneration, not by just scaling something that seems to work and scaling that up, but scaling across, learning, adapting endlessly the flows of energy and possibility from one place and carrying that over somewhere else? How do we ground all of this in traditional knowledge? Because regeneration is not, it's just not a new concept. It's the most ancient thing in the world. And we have to build bridges, very, very gracefully with all of these ancient ways of working with land, with people, with the human heart. And what's the role, of bioregional governance? How do we connect all of this globally while working locally? Is that just impossible, or is there value in having this deep local experience and then beginning to bridge that around the world? And then ultimately, how do we work across these different worldviews, the different kinds of action that people are drawn to, these different kinds of capital, these different scales? So what's next? What's kind of emerging, in this summit, in the action around the world, that is, it's so incredible, this unbelievable flowering of creativity, right, around bioregioning all over the world. How do we even make sense of that, harness it, link it up, resource it effectively, so that we can have lots of sense makers in the bioregion, lots of conveners, lots of eco-villages, lots of bioregional learning centers, anything that it might take for that bioregion to flourish. So I'll leave you with some of those questions, and Melina, maybe you can help me gather questions and facilitate the dialogue.
Sure. For me, it was really inspiring words, and I love the simplicity of this exposition of the complexity, because it lands on a common ground that we can all rely, and even if it is that simple of saying this is territories of life, based on love, and just go back there, and then it opens to a whole process of transition. So it's kind of like the simplicity always opens all this complexity, and that's really amazing. I want to Christina, would you like to name to ask your question?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I kind of have two questions. The first one was about the report that you mentioned. I think you said it was an ICCA report that's online.
Yes.
Yeah, so if you can share that afterwards, that's great. And thank you very much for the kind of presentation. I'm completely new to bioregioning and regional and everything. And I have to say, it's slightly confusing as an outsider. I'm sorry. I have come to a lot of talks, and it seems very, very highly above kind of what like normal outside people who have never heard of it before is. So it was good to kind of see lists of stuff that are regeneration units and kind of going, okay, this is very practical. And I know there's tons of resources that have been shared, but when you have a week, you don't really have time to go through and read everything. So I really appreciate you kind of breaking it down, and for kind of a simple outsider view. So thanks for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Christina.
And Melina, I also wanted to respond to that. On the other side of that complexity is just going back to connecting with your heart, right? Connecting with your gut, connecting with your core being, all the chakras, all the senses. What do I do next? And this is what we've been trying to figure out, right? Our entire history as a human species. It's not easy to be kind of this big, sometimes carnivore mammal wandering around, trying to be in a profound relationship with our landscapes. And it's the work of being human. So there's a long tradition of doing this. And at some point, maybe a culture that's healthy helps us, right? Be able to make those good actions from our heart over time. But at some point, there's no manual or perfect set of principles. And this is from someone, I've formulated many principles and frameworks over my lifetime. And as I hit, this stage in my life, I'm realizing it's all incredibly valuable and gives us ways to communicate and have shared action. And also we need to give each other space to realize we can act beyond ways to even express it. There's an intuitive edge, right, to all of us knowing what to do next.
I love that, Stuart. Yeah, thank you very much. Clement, please go ahead.
Hi, Stuart. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's nice to see all the highlights, and also from someone from an indigenous tribe and culture. We are very close to the equator, so it was quite nice to see the projection of all this. One of the things I'm trying to find more or less solutions or help with is this knowledge and techniques. We have been with our people, and like I also, when I started learning about regenerative agriculture and stuff, I was telling our people, I don't tell them this is something new. I only tell them we go back to what we were doing before. And then, but the difficulty comes in the fact that our people are becoming modern. They're trying to become modern, and in respect, they're just throwing away all the indigenous knowledge that we held dear. And unfortunately, the capitalistic nature of it's making it difficult to convince them that their way of doing it is the right way to keep it. How do we work? How do I approach this? Because that's my difficulty. If I'm telling them, look, let's go back into our previous way of building, let's use the architecture. And a lot of the time when I'm doing it, they tell, oh, because you have you're used to the Western life, so that's why you behave like this. They don't think I want to maintain my own culture. They think that my Westernization has made me to think that what they are holding on is valuable just because I've been exposed, and I want to, excuse me to say, it's like a mocking them to go back to their old ways. And so it's very difficult to kind of find the balance where I say, go back to your old ways, but everybody wants to build with a concrete building and a very complex architecture with glasses and stuff like this. And I'm here saying, go back to our own ways. Those were powerful ways. We didn't have such serious droughts when we were farming this way. We didn't have all these, but then they think I'm trying to push them back to poverty. That's the term. So how do we communicate this to our people in such a way that it's still valuable to them?
That's a great question. I have a feeling you're getting really good at communicating the value of the older ways. I'll throw that open. Does someone have kind of an experience that a way to talk about ancient versus modern? And yeah, I don't have a good resolution. It's complicated.
So I completely understand where you're coming from, Clement. So I'm in Jamaica in the Caribbean, and culturally we had certain ways of, kind of, well, when we were able to get land, farming and owning land was really, really important. So you protected it, and it was an important thing because it was you actually having ownership. But as time has passed, there is less importance on that, because as you have the grandparents and the older generation passing, the wisdom that was handed down, it's lost. So I know everything comes back to love, but I think also maybe there's a little bit of a kind of human nature about it. And we need to kind of have acceptance about just human nature, that there are not many people who are going to be on the same page at the same time. So, you know, the reason why we're in the situation that we are is because for humans, innovation is a great thing. And innovation through having more flashy things, cell phones and all of that, you know, it's a thing. And it's a part of our nature. And I'm not sure I don't think anybody here can come up with a way to get everyone on the same page of living off the land. Having a vegetable patch in your yard is important. I would love that if that was the case. But even for myself, when I was in my 20s, I wouldn't think about, ooh, I want to plant something in my backyard. I mean, you know, it takes you a time to get to that. And I think the most that any of us can do are we have initiatives in our communities, and we also work with, I'll say leaders in quotations, leaders who don't necessarily have assigned that value to those initiatives, but somehow, you know, communicating and bridging a gap that they do find some kind of value in it. And I think that's the only way forward. But there has to be an acceptance that it is also human nature to not necessarily value nature. It's not right, but it is who we are.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Clement.
Thank you.
Yeah, I acknowledge. I just want to acknowledge that we have 8 minutes to finish this conversation. But after that, there will be an open space here in this room, which open us to the possibility to keep this conversation going into an exploration, another exploration, kind of just deepening what is have said. But I want to honor the questions and the raised hands, so we
Alina?
can. Yes.
Can I make a suggestion as far as how we transition into the open space that's coming up?
Yes.
So typically we open up 9 breakout rooms for that. And I suggest we just do that immediately rather than waiting until we've run the open space process, and have everybody who wants to continue this conversation, or give them the option to go into, let's say, room 9, just label room 9 as continuing the last session. And then there doesn't have to be any interruption in the flow if people want to keep going. I don't know, Stuart, if you have more time and you want to go with them, or if you have to leave, but that would be a way to have our cake and eat it too.
So I open, Ben is the professional, Zoom professional, so I have to ask this.
Actually, you know what? No, we've got Trisha Chirimbo coming to run it. So you can actually just ask her to open those rooms, or I can do it when she comes. But we can just let people know that's an option and maybe plan for it now. For example, Stuart, do you have the ability and the desire to stick around if people want to keep going with you?
Yeah, I'll stay on. And while we're all together, I just wanted to thank you so much for the work that you're doing all over the world. Thanks for sharing a bit of a journey with me, and sending blessings to each of you and to the land that you love, the places you love.
Yeah, I'm in some of that right now, actually. The Upper Pagusset State Forest at dusk.
Good to see, Ben.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll ask
Marta,
Trisha to do that
please.
when the hour comes, and we'll just pause
And it
where
will
we
be
are,
just, yeah.
and people can just make their way in. Cool.
Should I say something now, or are we all moving? Oh, okay, this is in response to what Clement and Christina were saying. And it's sort of the thing I say all the time is, I think it's so important. And Stuart, I'm really sad that I missed most of it because I was in another meeting that just ended. shortly, but I can watch the whole recording. But coming from the clothing and textile industry in the past, and seeing what a massive marketing, the power of the marketing machine, I can completely understand how young people are more drawn to a brand than they are to their place. But I think that there's a way to give people back a certain pride in their region, in the traditions, because that's what's happening actually with fashion and with all the big brands, is they're seeking, they no longer have any kind of culture left. You know, the ones that were built on great designers of 100 years ago are now just chasing after the latest, you know, hip hop star or influencer. So I think that if there's a way to help people to recognize, I live in Switzerland right now. I'm from New England, so I have a very strong sense of place growing up in New England. But then I moved to New York, which is New York City is another amazing, everywhere you go, there are riches and there are people who bring culture with them. So I think that's kind of the secret, is to help people to make things again, to help them to make their own clothing, have maker spaces, grow their own fibers, but do it in a really cool way. I mean, we can make knit sports shoes, like running shoes and things. We can do that in a maker space. We can get one of those 3D knitting machines. You know, it doesn't have to be in a massive factory. So I think there's a way. And when people have that experience of like, well, I made this. This is mine, you know, this is me. It can take on so much more power than a swoosh or 3 stripes, you know, coming brand. So that would be, it's a process that will take time, but it's sort of like giving it back to the customer, to no longer be a consumer, but to be a maker. And I think ultimately that will just undermine the brand. The brands will just not have relevance anymore. They'll become so empty. So don't give up hope, Christina and Clement.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. Tricia.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Stuart. I love all of this being grounded in love. That's just so right on. And I really appreciate the fact that you also grounded things within a social justice framework as well, and kind of bringing that in as absolutely essential. And it also relates to what Clement was bringing in around, you know, how do we bring people back into that harmonious relationship? And I know, for instance, in the place that I live, without certain economic factors coming into play that allow people to move back into the right relationship with the land that they already know that they want to, but that they live so on the edge as far as being able, you know, it's like it was before, where they didn't have a monthly phone bill, they didn't have a monthly water bill, they didn't have a monthly electricity bill, and so they could play around. But now that they're in this kind of globalized system, they don't have those margins to be able to say, oh, okay, I'm going to transition my farm into a regenerative farm, and know that I have the leeway to take the time to make sure that I can get the return on investment. So I think one of the things is, how do we like really show the value of these ways of being in a financial way? And you brought in reparations, and I think that's really important, because if we can begin to bring people into more financial abundance by taking care of their place, then more people will be drawn to moving back into those ways of being. So that's my reflection.
Yeah, beautiful, making the financial flows work with living flows. Yeah, that's really important work.
That's our challenge now, and what I just heard with the last session with John Fullerton as well is that conversation. You know, like we are kind of collapsing something of all these possibilities and tries that can lead to something like that, which so for me, I want just to share a little bit, this whole thing is that we go, because I have been attending so many conversations within the summit, is kind of, there is this boom into the complexity, like a blow, and it is just blowing everybody's mind with, you know, like a, why so complex and what to do, and then it's kind of a collapse of it is so simple at the same time. There is just, I love what you say about the gate, how do you say that? The intuitive edge in which we all will know what to do next. And we are experiencing this breathing of the complex system. And I just want to acknowledge that, because we have been experiencing this in the summit. And I think that it is through that experience that we can start tapping into what needs to be done really in our actual life. So it's kind of just getting into the practice of navigating this complexity. So I find that your presentation is totally aligned with coming back to the simplicity of it. And so I just want to thank you for that and acknowledge that we don't need to worry about when the complexity opens again. Just be with the movement of opening complexity and coming back, converging into the simplicity of the same navigation. So for me, it's like the overview eagle of the summit and all these conversations. So I just wanted to share that here, because I think that it is really powerful what happened now. So I think that we arrived to the end of this conversation, Stuart. I don't know if I would like to invite you to if you have something to say to end this. And
no, just gratitude. Thank you all. Wishing you a wonderful, wonderful summit, and you know, great joy in trying to do this work. Should be joyful. We don't. None of us need to burn out trying to do this. You know, find where it meets your heart and your joy.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Stuart. Let's stop the recording.
Yeah, I don't have the Christina, can you no. Yeah. Trisha, are you
Trisha Chimble,
can you stop, please, the recording?
Oh, yeah, sure thing.
I just make her host.
Yeah, thank you.
If I could just say a word to introduce Trisha, and